Good morning, everybody. This is another day when I'm going to show you a few video clips and some tips and some pointers, and we'll start out with a few still photos, and then I'm going to jump into some clips and see if we can get this done before it takes too much of your time today. So this was something I wanted to talk about. A lot of the times if you get a vehicle, this is I think on a Dodge Dakota, that can come four-wheel drive or not four-wheel drive, you'll see these splines, these open splines in here. And this was deceptive to me because there was a situation where there was a four-wheel drive Ford pickup that for some reason or another we needed to let her drive it without the CV axle in it. And I said, well, that shouldn't be a problem. We'll just take the CV axle out and she can drive it in rear-wheel drive. And I don't remember the circumstances prevailing around this, but I do remember that whenever she started to drive off with no CV axle inserted in that Ford, that bearing hub came apart, and we wound up having to, replace the bearing hub and all that. And I'm thinking, I was thinking, well, if they make these bearing hubs like this without a CV axle in them, then this Ford should be able to drive without a CV axle in it. But it turned out I had to take an old CV axle and put it through the splines through the new hub and torque it just like I would if there was going to be a CV axle in there. So one size doesn't fit all on that. That was a learning experience I had. I don't know if you've run into that or not, but I flat sure did. That's right here. Look at these canister purge situation going on here. A couple of things I'm going to say about this. Your long fuel trim's at minus 12.5, and here you got minus 20. But one of the things that I found out, and I had told this guy this. Of course, looking at fuel trim, if it's negative fuel trim, you've got fuel getting in there for some reason, or you've got some reason there's not enough air. It's running too rich, so it's subtracting fuel to try to, on the long fuel trim, it'll subtract the long fuel trim until it can manage to get the short fuel trim where it'll stay around zero. So the long fuel trim is an adaptive learning thing. Anyway, this one guy came to me on his Dodge Durango, and he says, this thing will be sitting here idling, and all of a sudden it'll almost stall and everything. And I says, okay, let's look into this. So I put the scan tool on there, and I watched the scan tool when I was watching canister purge. And as soon as his canister purge kicked in and started trying to purge the canister, the engine almost stalled. And I said, have you been packing gas into this thing whenever you fill it up? He said, yeah, I usually try to get all of it in there I can. I said, stop packing gas and you'll stop having this problem. And I ran into that back when I was working at the Ford place. Some of these people would come in complaining about their vehicle would almost stall, and then it would catch itself and it might surge ahead and almost hit the car in front of it. And that one lady had a Windstar that was doing it. I said, do you pack the gas tank when you gas it up? And she told me she did, and I said, stop doing that. So she stopped packing the gas, and that problem went away. So whenever if that canister starts to get a little saturated with gas because some fuel is migrating down that line that's going to the canister that's supposed to only be carrying vapor, and then this thing starts purging. And nowadays, ever since OBD2 and the enhanced evap, they'll actually, some of them will start just purging anytime. They used to just purge only when you were driving it, like when you had EGR and all. And now they're liable to start purging it when you're sitting at a stoplight. And if it pulls a bunch of gas in there, almost stalls the engine, the idle control, whether it's throttle body or whatever, if it's idle air control or electronic throttle body, is going to, overcorrect to try to catch it. And if you're not holding your foot on the brake very hard, it's liable to surge ahead. And I have known of people, crashing into the vehicle in front of them because they packed their gas tank and they didn't understand how all this worked. Moving on. Now this right here, if you see a power steering pump pulley that's not pressed on there all the way, it's going to shred the belt because it's going to be out of line. The belt's going to be out of line. It's supposed to be pushed all the way on there like this. I had some trouble getting my Ford pickup belt, pulley all the way on there. We know it cracked and broke around here one day, and I was going to put a pulley on it. Bought one of those Chinese pulleys like you buy from the parts store, and it absolutely, my tool, and it's pretty good, but would not push this pulley all the way onto that pump. It just absolutely wouldn't do it. It would stop right there. And so I took the pump off and put it in the vise and I just forced that pulley on there. I actually had grease on there too and everything, but those Chinese parts, some of them are, the tolerances are off just enough to where you're going to have some issues getting them to fit right. And these, one example is these pulleys, power steering hoses. If they've got a, like on some of them Jeeps, if they've got a flexible joint in the middle of them, you know, there's a metal flexible joint that's supposed to allow for movement, and you turn the, you put that hose on there, it looks just fine. You turn the power steering all the way into the lock, and it poof, it blows it apart right there, you know. So some of these Chinese parts, I guess, are okay. A lot of them aren't. So we got to be able, we got to watch out for those. This right here is a little short story. This Mercury Capri was real popular in the very early 70s, and those were cool little cars. And they were a lot partially German in design. And the guy at the gas station that I worked at, in a gas station I looked at, looked almost just like this one here. And I says, didn't have a friend over the pumps or anything like that. But I told the guy, we lost about bell housing bolts. And he says, well, I don't have any metric bolts around here. And so he picked that bolt up, drove it down. We drove down to my dad's Volkswagen shop, and he says, do you have a metric bolt like this? And my dad says, that's not a metric bolt. That's 3/8 US standard. He could just look at it and tell. And the guy that I worked with was a good mechanic. I mean, I had a tremendous amount of respect for what he knew, but he could not look at a bolt and tell you whether it was metric or standard. And it's pretty simple. You can look at the head of it, but even if the head's doesn't have marks, you can still look at the threads. If you're knowledgeable about bolts, you can recognize whether it's metric or standard. Usually pretty close to what size it is. I used to have these bolts in this you know, junk box of bolts. You know, every shop's going to have a box of bolts. You know, you don't throw bolts away. And so I would take my students and have them lay out 10 bolts. Just pick 10 bolts at random out of here. Lay them out on a towel in order. Then I'd give them a sheet with 10 lines filled out, and I'd say, first thing I want you to do is guess at the size and the thread pitch and whether it's metric or standard. And then I want you to see if you can guess at the wrench size. And then in this next column, I had them where they would actually go and measure it, measure the thread pitch, see if it was metric or standard. And they would also pick up wrenches and see if they guessed it right. But I was trying to teach my students so that they could grasp looking at a bolt and very closely determining wrench size and very closely determine thread pitch and, you know, bolt diameter. And it's kind of tricky. I would talk to them about how metric and standard wrenches, some of them line up with each other and other ones don't, you know. Like, you know, my dad used both whenever he had some metric wrenches, he had a bunch of standard wrenches, and what he knew what would cross over, so I cut my teeth on that. And so, like for example, if you start down at 7/32, that's 5.5 millimeters, and they actually make 5.5 millimeter sockets, believe it or not. And then 6 millimeter doesn't line up with anything, 7 millimeter doesn't line up with anything, 8 millimeter and 5/16 are the same. 9 millimeter lines up with very little of anything. It's kind of close to 3/8, but you can't cross it over. 11 millimeter and 7/16 is real close together, all practically the same. And then 12 millimeter lines up with nothing. 13 millimeter is just a little bigger than a 1/2 inch, but not much. They'll usually cross over. You can usually take a 1/2 inch and put it on a 13 millimeter bolt head and it'll turn it, but it's kind of snug, but that's okay. 14 millimeter is a little smaller than 9/16. 15 millimeter lines up with nothing. 16 millimeter and 5/8 are real close, you know, because 8 and 5/16 are. And then 17 millimeter and 11/16 is close, not exact, but they're close enough where they usually cross over. 18 millimeter matches nothing. 19 millimeter and 3/4 are really close. 20 millimeter, that don't really match anything, and that's a rare size anyway. 21 millimeter and 13/16 are close. 22 millimeter and 7/8 are close. Because remember, 11 and 7/16, 22 and 7/8. And then you can go on up from there. 24 millimeter, real close to an inch, and blah blah blah, and all that kind of. But I used to, you know, tell them, you know, have them try to remember all of that stuff too. Not that it was all that important, but it was just a fun exercise, you know. What we're going to do is put this flywheel back on. What we might notice that if we just stick this flywheel up there, of course we know from the signature that's the way it goes. If we just stick the flywheel up there, we're going to have trouble lining up the holes, because nowhere do we turn it does it line the holes up right. So we're just having a hard time with that, see? But if you look at the signature, where this was, and where that was, see that place where it's rusty right there, where it was not in contact with anything, there's 2 of those circles, and there's 2 holes up here. So we look at the bigger one. The bigger one is what we're looking at, and that's lined up with that small hole there. So if we take that small hole and we line it up with that bigger one and put it on there, then this is absolutely perfect. And that's how the flywheel goes on there. You understand what I just told you? I know some of you guys are already saying, hey, that's not a flywheel, it's a flex plate. Yeah, whatever. You know, it's called a flex plate because as the torque converter expands when the fluid pressure builds, the plate's got to flex. Because the plate flex, you get a lot of flywheels that crack right around the center bolts. But the flywheel or the flex plate both have to be lined up just one particular way. You can't just put them on there anyway. You'd think with a bolt circle they make all the bolts the same, circles the same. I mean, they make all the bolts the same. But you gotta, a lot of times you'll put it up there and you'll turn it and you won't know until you get it at the right spot. You know, you may start one bolt, but the rest of them won't line up unless you got it lined up just right. And that's basically what I was talking about there. This is something I've talked about a time or two before. If you got fluid, like oil or coolant in the bottom of a bolt hole, you know, on a cylinder head or whatever, and you run this thing down and this happens to compress that fluid because the bolt's long enough to do that, it will bust that thing because you cannot compress that. And I've seen the guys bust things. Matter of fact, I didn't bust something, but I actually put head gaskets on a 440 Chrysler that I was rebuilding that I was going to be driving one time. And I cranked it up, drove it home, and it blew a head gasket because one of the bolts had fluid in the hole, and it basically stopped the bolt before it managed to get torqued. You know, against it wasn't pulling against the head. It stopped whenever it hit that compressed fluid. So what I told my students was get a blower and a rag and hold it around every head bolt hole and blow that junk out of there before you ever put those bolts in there, so you don't wind up with some kind of a fluid problem like that. And that just spins around like it wants to. And that, I expect, would probably make us overheat, because this is supposed to move with that, but as it turns out, it ain't doing it. That water pump was off a Dodge Caravan that was overheating, and the guy that owned it couldn't figure out why. He put a thermostat in it and some other stuff, and he couldn't figure out why it was overheating. Brought it over there, and the water pump wasn't moving the coolant. What we did was we pulled the heater hoses off and we looped them out with a clear hose, crank it up, there's nothing moving through there. I said, well, the water pump's not working for some reason. So we pull the water pump off and we find that this plastic impeller with that little aluminum bushing on the middle has released so that it's just spinning freely on the shaft, and that was an interesting little thing you don't see every day. Tools that you can make for yourself that's not very expensive is a terminal release tool. All you really need is this little part right here out of a wiper blade. This little stainless steel strip is very stiff and very strong, and it's in good quantity. There's a lot of it there, and so you can even put a little screwdriver handle on it like I've done on some. But you can take it and you can grind it off so that it's got this little tip on it. It works really, really well for unlatching terminals. All right, a couple of things about that. I used to pull those little stiff stainless steel strips out of wiper blades like that all the time and save them, because there's amazing how many things you can find you can use those for, because they're thin, but they're strong, and you can bend one really sharp and make a little hook or something to pull stuff out with. And I built terminal release tools out of them. You can grind them and flatten, you know, just whatever you want to make them where they'll flit down in there, and they're stiff enough to do that. You can't hardly do that with anything except one of those. But if you start saving those, and they're just useful for all kinds of stuff. They don't cost anything, is the best part of it. But you might notice all this stuff I got in my pocket here that these people used to make fun of me for carrying all that stuff in my pocket, but the same people that made fun of me for that were the ones that wanted to borrow that stuff whenever they were, they'd say, ha ha, look at all that junk you got in your pocket. They thought all of them were pins, but there was a pen, a pocket screwdriver, a flashlight, a magnet, a laser. I had all kinds of stuff in my pocket. And they just didn't understand why you had to have so much stuff in your pocket. But that was my toolbox, or sort of. And they were wanting to borrow tools out of there. Let me borrow your magnet. Let me borrow your flashlight. I was always hearing that all. Let me borrow your pocket screwdriver. Well, they didn't want to carry one. They wanted to laugh at me, but they wanted to borrow the, you know, ones that I was carrying. Wasn't that a surprise? That was a total. I've had lawnmower engines blow up on me, but I've never had one blow up quite like that. I saw that. I got that video online. I thought it was incredible.
I have good voltage here and almost no voltage there. Good voltage here, low voltage there. So what do you suppose is the problem? Folks, this can happen on your car too. Notice I got my test light hooked over here to the other side. Good, bad. Good, bad. All right, if we move this a little bit. Good, good. See?
I had that battery wired up to a bunch of power stations on my electrical workbenches in there, because these guys could, all of them had a little box with a positive and a negative post coming off of it on opposite sides of the box. And there was a circuit breaker and a little light in there, so that they could actually wire up stuff at their little workstations, and it was powered by this 12-volt battery. And but anyway, when I ran into this thing, the station's not working like they were supposed to. Somebody's trying to use them, and I found that test light would burn bright here, but that's voltage drop is what it is. You're losing voltage between here and here, basically, is what it amounts to. Motor mount. That was on a Cadillac. I thought that was interesting. And I always try to find an angle where I can get a picture of what's going on. Look at this one. You're going to enjoy this.
This battery is all it's going to take to light off the airbag over there.
I called my, I sent out an email one morning on the campus, and I told all the instructors and all the staff, I said, I'm going to light off an airbag in the parking lot. And a bunch of them came to watch, you know, because they wanted to see it happen. And some of those airbags jumped 10, 11 feet in the air. That one didn't, but it made a lot of smoke. Imagine all that smoke in the car. I mean, you know, that car gets filled up with all that smoke when that thing lights off. I mean, I had never had an airbag deploy in a crash, but I have deployed some airbags, and man, it makes a lot of smoke and it makes a big mess. It's really something. I like the one that pops out of the seat that keeps your head from hitting the B-pillar, but I'm not so sure I like the one coming out of the steering wheel, because it seems like it doesn't serve any purpose, and I've known of some people being injured by those things. But one way or another, there was another thing I used to do when I was teaching. There was a class right after I started teaching in 2001 called Fuel Systems that I had to teach. And one of the things I would do is I'd do something our welding instructor in high school. I took welding in high school. And this guy, what do is you take a torch, get a neutral flame, and pop that, you know, before the torch tip gets hot, you pop that out so that there's nothing but the neutral flame of oxygen and acetylene coming out of there. You fill a balloon up with that thing about as big as your head, tie it off, put it in a parking lot, throw a cigarette on it. You better have something over your ears, because that thing is incredibly loud. Now, it's not particularly dangerous, but it's really, really loud, and the main danger is going to be possible hearing loss if you're close to it. But there was a guy, I was going to demonstrate that at a dealership, and I had a torch and I did that. And I didn't want to make a lot of noise out there in the parking lot, so I made one about as big as a baseball, and it didn't make much of a noise. And that one guy said, oh, he sneered, neither one, nothing to that. And I said, hold on a minute. I made one about as big as my head. He was standing 30 feet away, and when I lit that thing off, he said he literally felt a shock wave go by and move his hair. I mean, that is incredibly loud. When I would do it out there, do that out in the parking lot there behind the automotive department, the guys from the diesel department down the road would come running out wanting to know what blew up. It was scary as all get out. I didn't do that a whole lot, you know, because I figured I'd be in trouble for disturbing the peace or something. This is a kind of a funny story, and that's a little thing I've created with AI. When I was a little kid, probably 5 years old, I was at my dad's foreign car garage, and there was a guy, I remember this very distinctly. I was standing there, and just standing in the shop. Dad had me in the shop. I'd ride around on creepers and play with ball bearings and all that kind of hogwash, and get my hands all greasy and wash them with that Gojo out there in that greasy sink. But anyhow, this car pulled up and it stopped on a extension cord that was plugged into the wall, into a socket over the bench. And there wasn't any, the way that the wiring code was back in the 1950s in South Alabama, or that part of that little town, they didn't worry about the way the thing was wired up, they just wired it up. And when that car parked on that cord, it pinched the wires together, and it didn't pop a fuse. It started spewing smoke from that cord. I kid you not, it looked like a dynamite fuse, and at about 1 foot every 2 seconds, it was burning that cord, going straight back toward the power source, just like you'd expect it. I'm talking about, it was spraying, that smoke it was spewing was probably 12 inches, just screw along there. And I'm standing over there watching this, and what did my dad say? He says, "Hey, Richard, get in there and unplug that cord quick." He was trying to get me to unplug the cord before it burned its way up to the, and I was terrified. I didn't want to touch that thing, Probably if I had touched it, it'd burn my hand. But anyway, that was Dad, That's like somebody telling somebody that's in a building that's burning, saying, "Get in there and stamp out those flames," Okay, so what you did was, tell me what your objective.
Up these fans so that you turn on, they go slow. And when you flip this little switch, it's just the toggles.
Yeah.
It's a high.
And that looks pretty complicated and everything, so you just really sort of figured that out on your own, didn't you?
No, it took me 6 attempts and this instruction guide.
You had an so now you know how fans are wired up, right?
Yeah.
All right then, cool. This is my grandson Andrew. It's my daughter's son, and this was when he was about 18 years old. This was like 10, 11, 12 years ago, whatever. I mean, he's getting up close to 30 years old now. But he had no training of any kind. He was just very, very smart. And he came up there to have rear brakes put on his Dodge, all the way from his mother. My daughter sent him up there from Tallahassee to where we were. And while they were working on putting the brakes on that, I figured I'd say, look at this board here, and with this little wiring instruction sheet, and see if you can figure out how to wire these fans up so they work the way they're supposed to. He did this very quickly. He didn't have any background in this or anything, but he had enough understanding of basic wiring and stuff, looking at that sheet and how to hook those jumper wires up, that he did that first time, the right time. I mean, it was just, I'm pretty proud of that kid. Anyway, he went on to do something else. He lives in San Francisco now. All right, this is the last slide. We've only been here 23 minutes. Hope you this didn't take up much of your time. Can you identify this? If you can tell me what we're looking at here, and I was right there. I took that picture, and this is actually a component from an automobile, and I need somebody that's watching this to send me a message and tell me what this is. I know what it is, but I'm not going to spoil it for you. I will tell you in your when you make the comment. I want to see how many comments I get on what this is. You can identify it. If you've seen it before, you'll know what it is. If you haven't seen it before, you'll make all kind of guesses and won't have a clue. But I'm not kidding you. This is actually something I saw in 2010. I saw this when I was at a school. Anyway, let me know, and I appreciate you guys coming around, and I'll talk to you next week. Hope you enjoyed all these video clips and tips, and we'll see you next time.